Thanks, Katie and Varsha, for really great curation for over the last day and a half, and thank you all for staying. I know those turkey sandwiches are calling you all, because they're calling me, but so I appreciate just the thoughtfulness that went into the curation of these conversations and the heart and mind space that all of the panelists brought to this conversation. So thank you. And of course, I want to give honor to the Algonquin speaking folks whose land we're standing on today. So again, my name is Sonya. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Engagement at Firelight. And as Katie said, we are a 19-year-old nonfiction film organization based in Harlem, run by master documentarian Stanley Nelson and his wife and partner, our superstar executive director, Marcia Smith. I'm going to just say a little bit about the scope of what we do at Firelight, but what I'm really going to talk about today is I'm really singing the gospel of historical documentaries, the sexiest genre of documentaries, and talk about why we make them as a production company, how we position and leverage them, and why we think they're so incredibly important and timely in this moment politically. So Firelight has 3 pillars to our work. First and foremost, we are a production company. We produce long fiction and now short nonfiction film, primarily centering the historic experiences of people of color, primarily African Americans, and most of our films end up on public television. Second, we mentor and support emerging doc filmmakers of color from around the country. That program is our Documentary Lab Fellowship. It's 10 years old this year. We've supported over 80 nonfiction filmmakers over the last 10 years. And then lastly, the piece of work that I do is we animate democracy and engage diverse audiences with our impact and engagement campaigns. And I'm going to show you just a little quick reel of our work so you get a sense of the span and the breadth of the films that we produce without the sound. So you're just going to see it and not hear it. So, as you can see, Stanley's films primarily chronicle the people and events that have shaped the African American experience in this country. These stories have explored the bravery of Emmett Till's mother, the powerful legacy of historically black colleges and universities, the people who followed Jim Jones into Guyana in search of a racial utopia, the young people who put their lives on the line to protect voting rights in Mississippi and desegregate buses across the South, the vision of Marcus Garvey and the boldness of the Black Panther Party. Together as a collection of films, they touch on the richness of the African American experience, struggle for sure, but resilience, community, adversity, and joy, always joy. Typically, historical documentaries are thought of as fodder for libraries and classrooms. No disrespect to libraries and classrooms. They are hugely important places to screen work. But our films also premiere on public television, at the Sundance Film Festival. They're seen in movie theaters, college campuses, academic and organizing conferences, Starbucks cafes, film studios, Capitol Hill, and my favorite place to bring our films, the Apollo stage. These are not typical places where historical documentaries are consumed. They are date night locations oftentimes. But we see our films as history come to life. If history texts were rigorous, emotive, entertaining, and sexy, that's our vision. That is what our work can do. That is what our work is about. Most of our historical documentaries explore the social movements that were born out of resistance. Resistance to enslavement, to Jim Crow laws, and to structural racism. They often explore youth-led movements, and they always run counter to the narrative of the big man theory of history. This is not, we love our charismatic leader and we're going to focus only on this one man's work. This is about collective organizing. And they delve deep into the strategy and the anatomy behind campaigns that many of us are not familiar with, but have changed the fabric of this country. They really demystify how change can be made through collective organizing. As someone who worked on social issue documentaries I've been at Firelight for about 16 years. I've been doing this work for a little over 23 years. And I worked for many years at Active Voice doing work on contemporary social issue documentaries. So when I came at Firelight, I really thought about how to develop strong strategies for campaigns around historical documentaries. It's a totally different beast. So we think about the role that historical documentaries play, and we think of them doing three things really well, in particular our films. First, we see them as a historical corrective to fill in the void of the lack of nuanced, complex narratives about the African American experience. We know firsthand, as an essentially all Black-led organization, we know what happens when our history is misunderstood, under-examined, distorted. I'm looking at you, Green Book, whitewashed. Two, we know that historical documentaries can bridge contemporary issues, conditions, movements in a way that contemporary social issue documentaries have a difficult time doing. They can help draw connections between events today and the past. And then because we make films about social justice movements, these films serve as inspiration to viewers to consider the power of what happens when ordinary people display extraordinary courage, when they work together in collaboration. We love making films about movements and institutions because change does not happen alone. So when we develop campaigns for our films, we think about them doing two things. One, there's a public goal that we have. We know that many of the issues in our films are not treated with the kind of depth that we would like in our American public education system. So we see our films as primarily sources of education, primary sources of education for many Americans about the role and contributions and experiences of African Americans. And that's a really important thing. And we do traditional things for campaigns. We build strong partnerships with organizations who can elevate our films. We have screening events, we do online engagement, the traditional campaign stuff. And that's really the forward-facing part of our work. Behind the scenes, we have other goals that are a bit more strategic and less visible. And we think about our films about campaigns as supporting contemporary social justice movements. We think about how these strong examples of successful organizing and nuanced visions of these efforts can support folks who are pushing their own progressive work today. So we use our films to connect with contemporary organizers, and we do that typically behind the scenes. So I'm going to share just a couple of examples of three of our films really quickly of how we've done that work on the public and more strategic stage. So our 2011 film, Freedom Riders, explored the 1961 campaign when groups of young Black and white civil rights activists participated in bus trips across the South to protest segregated bus and rail terminals. The film chronicled the strategy to push a reticent, democratic Kennedy administration to force Southern governors to uphold the 1960 Supreme Court ruling to desegregate these terminals. Our film released on the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides. So naturally, we supported lots of commemorative events to educate the public about these events that most Americans did not know much about. So there was a project to bring young college students to reenact the Freedom Rides and meet Freedom Rider veterans along the way. It was like beautiful. You felt like your heart opened up. It was beautiful. Stanley and the film and the remaining Freedom Riders were invited to be at the Oprah Winfrey Show, one of her last shows before her syndicated show ended. Beautiful moment, again, to celebrate these heroes. But more strategically, what was happening in the country at the time is immigrant rights movements were galvanizing around immigration reform. Dreamers, in particular, were impatiently waiting for the reticent Obama administration to make some moves on Dreamers and halt the stream of deportations of undocumented folks. They saw parallels with the Freedom Riders' impatience with the Kennedy administration and their impatience with the Obama administration. We knew the Dreamers and the broader immigrant rights movement were starting to meet with civil rights movement veterans behind the scenes, so we supplied copies of the film to trigger conversations about strategy. 2 years after the broadcast, over 900 immigrants boarded buses across the country to begin their immigrant freedom rides to call attention to the need for immigration reform on a national level. We worked with organizers to supply copies of our film on the buses as folks were arriving here in DC, again, to underscore both to support and provide inspiration, but underscore the need for solidarity across movements. Our next film, in 2014, Freedom Summer, chronicled the 1964 voter registration drive sponsored by the Congress on Racial Equality and SNCC. Once again, our film released on the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, and we used that anniversary to honor those Freedom Summer veterans, many of whom are still working today in the field. But again, the political landscape in 2014 was fraught. Voter suppression tactics were reshaping voter rolls in states like North Carolina and Florida in the lead up to the midterm elections. Mainstream news reports were treating these voter suppression tactics as totally isolated incidents, divorced from historic disenfranchisement of the black vote. So part of our effort as we talked about the film was to make sure we were drawing connections between voter suppression tactics then and now. At the same time, really outside of the glare of the lights of everyone patting themselves on the back about these amazing civil rights heroes with Freedom Summer, there was a new coalition of young organizers who had come from disparate movements, undocumented organizers coming from Occupy, groups who had become sparked and engaged around the murder of Trayvon Martin, and they started to coalesce and meet together and create a new coalition called Freedom Side. We knew a lot of these organizers just from our own personal relationships and organizing work, and because of our work on freedom riders. Some of these organizers came to us and asked for copies of the film to screen at both movement gatherings, but also strategy meetings behind the scenes, again, just to dissect organizing strategy. So when we were told by a couple of Freedom Side organizers that they had given a copy of our film to Valerie Jarrett in anticipation for a meeting they were having with Obama at the White House, we were like, surprised that they did that without asking us, and that it was shared with everyone at the White House. But I think the idea is that, that they are seeing this historical documentary, this unsexy historical documentary, as a really important tool for a springboard for conversation with a current administration. We created a Get Out the Vote toolkit to support GOTV organizing. We gave over 400 copies of that specifically to Asian American civic organizations around the country, again, to underscore solidarity work. Really quickly, Panthers. In 2016, we released the Black Panthers' Vanguard of the Revolution, which examined the rise and fall of the Black Panther Party. Again, our film released on the 50th anniversary of the founding of that party. And like the two previous examples, there was a new movement, the Movement for Black Lives, that was coalescing at the same time as our film was releasing. That movement, again, was sparked by the rash of high-profile murders of unarmed black men and women. So naturally, we sought to place the Movement for Black Lives along a spectrum of resistance to police brutality. We did that in our film messaging, but we also made sure that on panels with Panthers and at Q&As, we made sure there was a BLM generation organizer in those conversations as well. Not just to draw parallels to these movements, but also to talk about the differences between approaches to police brutality. We also knew from the past two campaigns that many of the young organizers that we worked with saw Firelight as a bridge to civil rights and Black Power veterans that they didn't have personal relationships with. So a lot of what we did outside of these big public events where we would be talking about these big issues is provide opportunities for these two really important generations of organizers to build personal relationships. Again, share strategy, share notes, debate, discuss, connect. We also really like public interventions. So when the People's Queen, Beyonce, performed her infamous homage to the Black Panther Party at the 2016 Super Bowl just 1 week before the broadcast of our film, she created the kind of juicy, delicious pop culture moment that was begging for nuance and depth and context, and our film jumped into that void. We worked with high-profile influencers, organizers, journalists, cultural commentators, artists, to use our film to reframe the conversation on police brutality that was playing out in mainstream media and on social media. So all of these examples highlight the really powerful role that docs can play in amplifying and supporting movements led by communities of color. But knitting these films into these movements requires more than transactional outreach strategies. It requires real deep understanding of how these movements move, what kind of tools they need, and when, and trust that you as a content provider and as an artist base understand the needs of the movement. And that takes time to build, and I know for all of these disparate campaigns that many of us are working on, we don't always have that time. So one strategy we're testing out is to recruit people from these movements and communities that we know filmmakers of color so desperately want to reach with their film campaigns. So we developed the Impact Producer Fellowship, a year-long program to recruit traditional producers, digital strategists, and community organizers of color, and mentor and train them in impact strategies for nonfiction film. They will work alongside filmmakers or simply bring those narrative strategy tools to the organizing work that they already do, and they can be the kinds of strategists that you wish was sitting within these movement organizations, and now they will be within these movement organizations. So ultimately, we do what we do because we believe there's power when we tell our own stories, and that those closest to an experience should have access to the tools to interpret that experience. We believe that when African Americans learn something about our history, the rest of the country benefits as well. And so we are unapologetic about focusing on our history and our audience, but we also make every attempt to build relationships and connection and solidarity across communities of color. We know that in this ahistorical time of ahistorical political debates, of journalism under attack, of an educational system that's failing our diverse population, the role of historical documentaries takes on even more power. So we urge you to consider and reconsider the role of historical docs. And we believe that the work of shaping our future belongs to all of us, but we have to have a grounding in history to be able to really interpret today and shape the future. So as we say to audiences, watch history, then make history. That's our call to action. Thanks.